For the Countess, the mirror was a merciless god, showing her the one enemy she couldn't defeat, time. But one day, a clumsy seamstress pricked her finger. A single, perfect droplet of blood fell upon the Countess's pale hand. And where it touched, she believed she saw a miracle. The skin became smooth, youthful, alive. It was a horrifying revelation. If one drop could do this, what could a flood achieve? An obsession was born, one that would be paid for with the lives of 600 girls. Amid the misty spurs of the Carpathians, the castle loomed like a blackened fang, biting into the low, leaden clouds. The year 1585 had been damp and cold, a season of perpetual twilight where even the fortress stones seemed to weep with a chilling moisture. The very land around it felt sick, the gnarled trees clinging to the slopes with skeletal fingers, their branches perpetually dripping onto the sodden, moss-covered earth below. To approach was to feel the world shrink, the sky pressing down and the forest closing in. No birdsong dared to challenge the profound stillness, no scurrying creature disturbed the rotting leaves on the path. The fortress did not command the landscape, it poisoned it, a dark heart from which a slow, creeping dread radiated, palpable as the chill that seeped through the thickest wool cloak and settled deep within the bones of any who drew near. The great iron-banded gates opened without a sound, a silent maw swallowing the dim light of day. Inside, the courtyard was a barren expanse of slick, uneven cobblestones, devoid of life. The air grew immediately colder, a tomb-like chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a coldness that emanated from the very masonry, a stagnant frigidity that had not felt the warmth of the sun in centuries, if ever. Within the great hall, a profound gloom reigned, disturbed only by the fitful, sputtering light of a few torches. Their resinous smoke, thick and black, coiled towards a ceiling lost in impenetrable darkness, failing to illuminate so much as to animate the shadows. The wavering flames cast a grotesque theater upon the walls, making the hulking shapes of furniture and armor writhe and contort like living things in silent torment. The air was heavy and motionless, a physical weight upon the chest that made each breath a conscious effort. It was saturated with the smells of damp earth and decay, of wilting herbs left to rot in forgotten corners, and of something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sweetness lingered beneath the other odors, a cloying scent that caught in the back of the throat and hinted at spoiled meat and overripe fruit. In this oppressive stillness, every sound was an intrusion, magnified and distorted. The distant, methodical drip of water from a leaking parapet echoed like a mallet striking an anvil. The scuttling of a rat behind the wainscoting sounded like the dragging of chains. The creak of a single floorboard underfoot became a scream that ripped through the silence, each vibration traveling through the cold stone and into the soul. The ensuing silence that rushed back in was even worse. It was not an absence of noise, but a presence in itself, a vast, listening entity that seemed to observe from the darkened corners and the empty suits of armor that stood sentinel along the corridors. It was a suffocating blanket woven from the threads of countless unspoken secrets, a quiet that buzzed with the potential for a sudden, piercing shriek. This quiet was not peaceful but predatory, pregnant with a tension that tightened the nerves and quickened the pulse. It was the silence of a place that had witnessed horrors so profound they had permanently muted the very air. To exist within it was to feel scrutinized by unseen eyes, to feel the weight of atrocity seeping from the very pores of the ancient, weeping stone. The castle itself felt alive, but its life was one of pain and memory. Every long, vaulted hallway was a throat that threatened to swallow you whole, every archway a gaping mouth. The tapestries that lined the walls, thick with the dust of ages, depicted grim scenes of hunt and battle, but in the flickering torchlight, the woven figures seemed to shift and suffer, their silent agonies a constant, whispering reminder of the violence that was the foundation of this place. The castle breathed, but its exhalations were of sorrow and fear. The wind moaning through a broken arrow slit was not the sound of nature, but a chorus of lost voices. This place was a monument to an unspoken dread, a silent testament to a terror that had not yet been given a name but was felt in the marrow of anyone who crossed its threshold. The quiet was a promise of what was to come, a patient, waiting horror. The Countess moved through the enfilades of rooms like a silent shadow, a whisper of silk over stone. Her passage was a disturbance in the stagnant air, yet it made no sound. She did not walk, she glided, her form a dark current in the river of gloom that was her home, her presence an ache felt in the walls long before her shape resolved from the darkness. Her face, once the celebrated beauty of all Hungary, was now a mask of polished alabaster. Emotion had been bled from it, leaving behind a placid, unnerving stillness. The skin was stretched taut over fine bones, a canvas of unnatural pallor that seemed to absorb the meager light of the torches, giving nothing back. It was a face that had forgotten how to smile or frown. She would spend hours before the tarnished Venetian glass of her looking-glass, a hulking object framed in black and silver. The mirror did not offer a clear image but a clouded, watery distortion, a reflection seen through a veil of years. In its depths, she hunted for the ghost of the woman she had been, a specter of vanished youth. Her scrutiny was a form of methodical self-torture. She would trace the faint, web-like lines that encroached upon the corners of her eyes, the subtle loosening of the skin along her jawline. These were not mere signs of age, they were insults, the crude graffiti of time scrawled upon a masterpiece. Each new imperfection was a fresh betrayal. This ritual was her only true devotion. Her reflection was her god and her enemy, an oracle that spoke only of decay and the inevitable victory of the grave. The terror of her own mortality was a cold stone in her gut, a fear so profound it had hollowed out everything else, leaving only this obsessive, silent vigil against the inexorable march of days. One afternoon, during a fitting, a seamstress pricked her own finger with a needle. The girl flinched, stifling a cry. The Countess, annoyed by the interruption, seized the girl's hand to inspect the interruption. A single, perfect bead of crimson welled from the tiny wound, impossibly bright in the gloom of the chamber. The droplet fell, landing squarely upon the back of the Countess's own pale hand. It was a shock of warmth and color against her frigid skin. For a moment, she merely stared at it, this small, vivid jewel of life resting on the vellum of her flesh. The girl trembled, expecting a blow for her clumsiness, for having stained her mistress. But the blow never came. The Countess was transfixed. The world had shrunk to that single point of contact. The warmth of the blood seemed to penetrate her skin, a sensation she had not felt in years. She dismissed the terrified seamstress with an abrupt, dismissive wave, her eyes never leaving the bright red spot on her hand. Alone, she raised her hand closer to her face, studying the droplet as a scholar would a rare text. It was not merely a stain, it was a promise. Slowly, deliberately, she smudged the blood with her finger, spreading it in a thin, glistening film. She held her breath, watching as the liquid began to dry, a strange anticipation tightening her chest. When she wiped the smear away with a piece of lace, her breath caught. The skin beneath, or so it seemed to her starved and hopeful gaze, was changed. It looked smoother, the texture finer, the deathly pallor lessened. It seemed to glow with a faint, stolen vitality, a stark contrast to the crepe-like skin surrounding it. She pressed the spot with a fingertip. It felt softer, more resilient. It was the skin she remembered from 20 years prior. An impossible, electrifying thought took root in the barren soil of her mind. This was not an illusion. It was a miracle. A secret whispered to her by chance, a key to unwinding the cruel clockwork of time. A new kind of light kindled deep within her dark eyes. It was not the warmth of life, but the cold, hungry flicker of a predator that has caught the scent of its prey. The listless despair that had animated her for years began to recede, replaced by a focused, terrifying energy. She had found a purpose beyond her silent war with the mirror. Her movements, once aimless and drifting, now had direction. She began to spend more time in the less traveled parts of the castle, her steps leading her down into the colder, deeper levels of the fortress. She explored forgotten cellars and stone-walled chambers that had not seen daylight in a century, her mind working, planning. The oppressive silence of the castle began to change. It was no longer simply empty. It became a vessel for something new, a sound that did not belong. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint vibration felt through the soles of the feet more than heard, a low hum from the very foundations of the earth. Then, on nights when the wind howled around the battlements, it carried other noises with it. Faint, high-pitched sounds, like the cry of a distant animal, would be caught and then snatched away by the gale. They were thin and sharp, easily mistaken for the shriek of the wind itself through the crenellations. But they were not the wind. They were human. They rose from the bowels of the castle, from a place deep beneath the stone floors and tapestried walls. They were the sounds of terror and of pain, muffled by countless tons of rock, but they were there. A new, secret music had begun to play in the halls of the silent fortress, a horrifying lullaby for its ageless mistress. Beneath the castle, hidden behind a false wall in a disused wine pantry, was a secret passage. It was not a grand affair of myth, but a cramped, spiraling staircase hewn from the living rock, descending into the cold, silent belly of the earth. The air grew colder and thinner with each step, the torchlight seeming to shrink away from the oppressive, damp darkness that pressed in from all sides. This was the path plied by her most trusted servants, a select few whose souls were as bound to her as the stones were to the mountain. They were her procurers, her silent shepherds. They ventured into the desperate villages that clung to the slopes of the Carpathians, spinning tales of good, well-paid work for strong girls within the Countess's household. The promises were a potent lure. For a life of relentless poverty and hunger, the castle represented an almost unimaginable salvation. The girls arrived with small bundles containing all they owned, their faces a mixture of hope and nervous apprehension. They were led not to the kitchens or the sewing rooms, but to this hidden door and down into the waiting silence. The staircase ended in a vast, vaulted cellar, a chamber that felt more ancient than the castle built above it. There were no racks for wine, no stores of food. The room was utterly bare, its purpose singular and grim. The only feature was a bizarre construction of wrought iron that stood in the precise center of the stone floor, commanding the space like a dark altar. It resembled a sarcophagus, an upright coffin shaped vaguely in the form of a woman, but its surface was unadorned, save for the hinges and a heavy latch. Its presence was a silent, metallic scream in the stillness of the chamber. It was a thing made for a single, terrible purpose, and it waited with an inanimate, eternal patience for its next occupant. The ritual was always the same. The girl, her hope finally curdling into a stark, uncomprehending terror, would be forced towards the iron effigy. The heavy, grated door of the device would be swung open, revealing the true horror within. The interior was not smooth, but studded with dozens of razor-sharp iron spikes, angled inward. The Countess would observe from a carved stone chair set against the far wall, a spectator at her own dark theater. Her face remained a placid mask, her eyes alight with a clinical curiosity. There was no rage in her, no pleasure in the screams. There was only a cold, focused intent, the detached interest of an alchemist observing a crucial transmutation. Once the victim was enclosed, the door would be slowly, deliberately closed. The spikes were cunningly designed not to kill outright, but to pierce and puncture, to drain the lifeblood in a steady, efficient flow. A small trough at the base of the device collected the warm, crimson liquid, funneling it into a silver basin placed carefully on the floor. Over time, the chamber itself began to transform. The pale, sweating stone of the walls and floor developed a deep, permanent stain. The constant spatter and overflow had dyed the masonry a dark, layered brownish red. The very mortar seemed to have absorbed the essence of countless deaths, trapping the final moments of terror within its grit. The air became thick and almost unbreathable, a foul miasma of fresh blood, old decay, and the metallic tang of fear. The sweetish, cloying odor that haunted the upper halls was born here, its source a relentless, unending sacrifice. It was a stench so profound, so unnatural, that it defied the very laws of the living world. Even the vermin, the hardy rats that thrived in the castle's other dungeons and cellars, shunned this place. They would not cross the threshold, repelled by an aura of death so concentrated it had become a physical barrier. The chamber was an island of absolute corruption, a dead space where not even the lowest forms of life would venture. For hours, the Countess would remain in her stone throne, long after the last tremor had ceased and the silence had returned, deeper and more violated than before. She watched the slow drip into the basin, her patience absolute. This was her laboratory, her temple, and the blood was her holy water, the elixir that held the promise of her own resurrection from the ravages of time. The years turned, seasons blurring into a meaningless cycle beyond the arrow slits. Winter's ice and summer's haze were phenomena of a world to which she no longer belonged. Her calendar was marked not by moons or harvests, but by the arrival of new faces, fresh vessels brought to replenish her stores. The castle was sealed in its own timeless, repeating present. The number of disappearances grew from a trickle to a steady, silent stream. A girl gone from a remote village, then another from a town further down the valley. At first, they were tragedies spoken of in hushed tones, misfortunes attributed to wolves or the hazards of the road. But the pattern, once established, was impossible to ignore. A new kind of story began to circulate, carried by merchants and itinerant tinkers. It was a rumor born of fear, a whisper that traveled from one tavern hearth to another, growing darker and more detailed with each retelling. It spoke of the great castle in the mountains, the one that offered work but from which no one ever seemed to return. They called her the Blood Countess. The tales described a monster in human form, a noblewoman who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her unnatural beauty. The stories were fantastical, grotesque, the kind of things peasants invent to explain the cruelty of their world. But they persisted, taking root in the collective dread of the kingdom. The castle, once a proud symbol of the Bathory name and a bastion of power, began to curdle in the public imagination. It became a place of superstitious terror, a dark fog on the horizon that travelers would take great pains to avoid. Locals would make the sign against evil when its towers were visible, hurrying their children indoors as twilight fell. The fortress itself seemed to absorb the malice within its walls. The stones grew darker, slick with a perpetual dampness that was not of the rain. A deeper cold emanated from it, a chill that clung to the very air for miles around. The silence that surrounded it was no longer empty, but thick with the weight of unspeakable things. The Countess herself had become a recluse, a ghost in her own domain. She had not passed beyond the castle gates in years. The world outside had faded into a distant abstraction, a reservoir from which she drew her subjects. Her existence had contracted to the cold stone corridors, the tarnished mirror, and the secret chamber below. Her regimen had changed her. The skin that she so cherished had achieved a new state, but it was not the flush of life. It was a smooth, porcelain whiteness, an unnatural pallor that seemed to have no blood beneath it. It was the flawless complexion of a doll or a freshly washed corpse, beautiful and utterly terrifying. Her eyes, however, burned with a stark, feverish light. They were black pits of obsession, devoid of any recognizable human emotion. When she looked upon her servants, she no longer saw people. She saw only veins, skin, and the precious fluid that ran beneath. She was a farmer, and they were her livestock. The harvest was all that mattered. In the late hours of the night, in the solitary quiet of her scriptorium, she practiced her other art. By the light of a single candle, she would open a large, leather-bound book, its cover clasped with tarnished brass. This was her ledger, her one true confidant, the silent witness to her great work. With a quill pen and a pot of iron gall ink, she would make her entries. Her calligraphy was exquisite, a model of precision and grace. Each letter was a perfectly formed loop and stroke, elegant and controlled. The neat, flowing script stood in horrific contrast to the words it was used to write. She recorded everything. The name of each girl, her age, the village from which she had come. Then followed the clinical, detached descriptions of the torments inflicted. She noted the methods used, the duration of the suffering, and, most importantly, the quality and quantity of the yield. It was the logbook of a meticulous and insane scientist. The pages filled, one after another. The list of names grew, a silent, screaming chorus inked onto the vellum. It was a litany of the lost, a catalogue of extinguished lives. Each entry was a small, neat tombstone in this graveyard of paper. The act of writing was its own ritual, a way of imposing order on the chaos of her butchery. She would reread previous entries, her finger tracing the names, not with remorse, but with a kind of detached pride. This was her legacy, the true measure of her struggle against time. The book was more precious to her than any jewel, for it held the proof of her victory, the cost of each stolen moment of youth. The ink soaked into the page, becoming a part of the book, just as the blood had soaked into the stones of her cellar. The castle and the diary were one, a complete and sealed testament to her monstrosities. As the years passed, the book grew heavy with the weight of its contents. Eventually, the final page was filled. The Countess paused, her pen hovering over the last available space. She wrote the last name with the same steady hand as the first, then the final, terrible accounting. The list, compiled over decades of methodical slaughter, had reached its conclusion. The final tally was 650. It came in the deep heart of a December afternoon in the year 1610. A sound the castle had not heard in a generation, a sharp, insistent, authoritative knocking at the main gate. It was not the sound of a supplicant, but of a demand. The heavy oak shuddered under the force of the blows. The echoes reverberated through the stone, a seismic shock in the stagnant silence. Servants froze in their tasks, their faces turning to one another in confusion and fear. Unscheduled visitors were an anomaly, official visitors bearing the king's seal were an impossibility, a concept from a forgotten world. The Countess, interrupted in her study of the clouded mirror, felt a flicker of annoyance. It was an unwelcome intrusion, a discordant note in the carefully composed symphony of her isolation. She did not feel fear, only a profound sense of impatience with the world outside for daring to remember her existence. It was her cousin, the Palatine Georgi Thurzo, who stood before the gate. His face was grim, set like granite against the biting wind. He was not there for a social call. He had been sent by the king himself, armed with a royal mandate to investigate the monstrous rumors that had finally become too persistent, too numerous to ignore. His soldiers, grim-faced and armed, stood behind him. They were not an honor guard, they were an occupying force. They stared up at the malevolent silhouette of the fortress, their expressions a mixture of duty and a deep, superstitious dread. They had all heard the stories whispered by the fire. The gates, groaning in protest, were opened. Thurzo and his men entered the courtyard, and the silence within the walls fell upon them like a shroud. They felt the unnatural cold, saw the lifelessness of the place. The very air they breathed felt ancient and corrupt, thick with a palpable sense of sorrow and decay. The Countess received them in the great hall. She stood alone before the cold hearth, a figure of pale, unmoving composure. Her face was a placid mask, her dark eyes showing no surprise, no alarm. She regarded her cousin and his armed escort as if they were merely a troupe of inconvenient players who had wandered onto her stage. Thurzo did not waste time on pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and hard, a hammer striking stone. He spoke of the king's concern, of the countless petitions from villages mourning their lost daughters. He spoke of the dark stain that had spread over their family name, a stain he was now here to inspect. Her response was a faint, dismissive smile. She denied everything with an arrogance born of absolute power and profound disconnection from humanity. The peasants were liars, prone to fantasy. Their daughters had simply run away. She was the victim of slander, of jealousy. Her composure was absolute, unwavering. But Thurzo had not come to argue. He gave a sharp command, and his men began to search the castle. They moved with methodical purpose, their armored boots echoing in the long-neglected halls. They were a sudden, violent intrusion of order into a realm of pure, hidden chaos, their torches cutting through a gloom that was centuries deep. They found nothing in the upper chambers but dust, decay, and a profound sense of misery. But the lower they went, the stronger the sweet, cloying smell became. One of the Countess's inner circle, a hunched creature named Darvulia, broke under the questioning of a soldier and, with a trembling finger, pointed to the wall in the pantry. The false wall was smashed down with iron sledgehammers, revealing the dark, tight spiral of the secret stair. A wave of foul, cold air washed over the men, a stench so vile that several of them recoiled, choking. Thurzo, his face a mask of grim resolve, took a torch and led the way down into the darkness. The descent was a journey into hell. The air grew thick, viscous, and the smell of death became a physical presence that clung to the back of the throat. The stones wept a dark, greasy moisture. The silence here was different, not empty but full, humming with the echoes of unimaginable pain. What they found in the cellar broke them. Soldiers who had seen the horrors of the battlefield, who were hardened to blood and death, stopped dead. Some turned away, vomiting. Others simply stared, their faces draining of all color, their eyes wide with a horror that would never leave them. In the center of the chamber stood the iron sarcophagus, its metal skin stained dark. Around it on the floor lay the ruins of human beings. They were not bodies, but things that had once been bodies, now twisted and broken. The evidence of prolonged, systematic torture was carved into what remained of their flesh. But that was not the worst of it. From the shadows came a sound, a faint, rustling whimper. In small, filth-strewn cages along one wall, they found others. Girls who were still alive. They were skeletal, their bodies a lattice of weeping sores and half-healed wounds. Their eyes were vacant, shattered windows into souls that had been utterly destroyed. One of the soldiers, his voice trembling with a mixture of pity and rage, knelt and opened a cage. The girl inside did not move. She only stared, a thin, animalistic keen escaping her lips. She had been trapped in the darkness for so long that the torchlight was a physical agony to her. The world of the living was now alien to her. Thurzo stood in the center of the abomination, the torchlight casting his shadow long and terrible against the blood-soaked walls. He looked from the dead to the living, and his face, once merely grim, was now transfigured by a righteous and terrible fury. The whispers had been a pale shadow of this reality. He ascended the stairs, his movements stiff, his eyes burning. He re-entered the great hall where the Countess still waited, her placid expression unchanged. Her accomplices, the core servants who had aided her, were now huddled together, their faces a mask of dawning terror. They understood, now, that the game was over. Thurzo did not need to speak. The horror was written on his face, the stench of the cellar clinging to his clothes. He simply gestured to his men. The Countess and her 4 principal servants were arrested on the spot. She did not resist. As the soldiers put their hands on her, her only reaction was a slight tightening of her lips, a flicker of distaste at being touched. The trial that followed was a sensation throughout the kingdom. It was not a single event, but a long, agonizing process of unearthing a horror of unimaginable scale. Witness after witness was brought forward. The final count was over 300, surviving victims, villagers who had lost their daughters, and even former castle servants. Their combined testimony painted a picture of a hell on earth that staggered the court. They spoke of tortures of an ingenuity so vile it seemed beyond human invention. They spoke of the Iron Maiden, of needles, of fire, and of cold. They spoke of the Countess observing it all with a calm, detached interest. The servants, broken and terrified, confessed to everything. They detailed their roles in luring the girls, in assisting in the torture, in disposing of the bodies. They were the hands, but she had been the mind. Their confessions sealed their fate. They were found guilty of monstrous crimes and condemned to death. Their executions were brutal. 2 had their fingers torn out before being thrown into a fire. The 3rd was beheaded. They were made an example of, their deaths a public spectacle to appease the horrified kingdom. But the architect of it all, the noble Countess, was another matter entirely. A public trial and execution for a member of the high nobility, a battery, was unthinkable. It would bring a shame upon the family and the kingdom that the authorities could not countenance. The political cost was too high. Behind closed doors, a deal was struck. Her guilt was undeniable, but her name was her shield. She was spared a public trial. She was spared the executioner's sword. Her powerful family, seeking to contain the scandal and bury the horror, intervened. Justice would be done, but it would be a private, hidden justice, as secret as the crimes she had committed. The world would not be allowed to see a Countess Bathory humbled in a public square. Her sentence was not death, but a living burial. She was to be entombed within the very heart of her own power, a prisoner in the fortress that had been her instrument. Her name, too powerful to be dragged through the mud of a public execution, had saved her from the sword only to deliver her to this colder, slower fate. The masons arrived on a gray, windless morning. They were local men, their faces pale and set, their eyes avoiding the gaze of the woman they were about to wall away from the world. They worked with a grim efficiency, mixing their mortar in silence, the scrape of their trowels the only sound in the dead air of the corridor. She watched them work without a word. She offered no plea, no curse. Her face remained the serene, alabaster mask it had become. She observed the construction of her own tomb with the same detached curiosity she had once reserved for the dying moments of her victims. Her silence was more unnerving than any scream could have been. Stone by stone, they sealed the windows, blotting out the gray Carpathian light for the last time. The room grew progressively darker, the shadows deepening until they consumed the corners entirely. The rhythmic scrape and tap of their trowels was a slow, methodical punctuation marking the end of her world. The last rectangle of sky dwindled, then vanished. The door was next. They laid the final course of stones with practiced hands, leaving only a small, narrow slot near the floor, an opening barely wide enough for a hand to pass through. Through this fissure, a plate of food and a jug of water would be passed. It was her only link to the world of the living. Then the sound of the masons departed, their footsteps fading down the corridor. A new silence fell, absolute and profound, a blackness that was as much a sound as an absence of light. She was alone. In the dark. Her sentence had begun. 3 years passed. The world outside the stone continued its turn. Seasons came and went, their passing marked for her only by the changing temperature of the stone against her skin and the chill of the water in her jug. Time lost all meaning, becoming a single, unbroken ocean of darkness. She did not descend into madness, for she was already its queen. Instead, her mind, deprived of all external stimuli, turned inward with a terrifying, crystalline focus. Her body might be a prisoner, but her will remained sovereign. Her great work, she felt, was not yet finished. She still had the book. In the crushing dark, she wrote, feeling for the lines on the page with the long fingers of one hand while the other guided the quill. Her once elegant script grew ragged, a scrawl born of pure will, but she continued to write, documenting the final stages of her experiment. She no longer ate the food that was passed through the slot. She drank only the water, her body withering away, becoming as dry and brittle as an old husk. This, she believed, was a necessary purification, a shedding of the mundane flesh that held her back from her final transformation. On the 21st day of August, in the year 1614, the guard who pushed the daily meal through the slot received no response. The plate from the day before was untouched. He called out. Only the deep, oppressive silence of the castle answered him. An order was given. With crowbars and hammers, the guards broke down the new wall. The stones, set only 3 years prior, came away grudgingly, releasing a gust of cold, stale air that smelled of dust and something else, something vaguely like dried lavender. The room was a pocket of absolute night. When they brought in a torch, the light revealed a scene of Spartan decay. The countess lay on a simple cot, a withered, emaciated figure. Her skin was like brittle parchment stretched over a skeleton, her hair a white, lifeless tangle. Her war against time seemed, finally, to have been lost. But their eyes were drawn to the table. There, laid open as if for their inspection, was the leather-bound diary. The final page was covered in a spidery, almost illegible hand, the ink faded in places where the quill had run dry. It was clear the entry had been made with the last of her strength. The final entry was not a plea for forgiveness or a cry of despair. It was a declaration of triumph. With a weak and wavering hand, she had written that the blood had done more than preserve youth. It had healed. It had been the cure for a secret malady she had never revealed to the world. She claimed it had purged her of the violent seizures that had plagued her in secret since she was a child, a condition she saw as a weakness, a flaw in her noble bloodline. This, she wrote, was the ultimate proof that the elixir was not merely cosmetic, but a true font of life, the key to a deeper, more permanent state of being. But the final lines were the most chilling. She wrote that her physical death was not a defeat, but a necessary and planned transition. She had achieved a new form of immortality. By consuming the life essence of so many hundreds upon the ground where the castle stood, she had become one with the place itself. Her spirit, she claimed, was now infused into the foundation, her consciousness woven into the very rock and mortar of the fortress. She was no longer a prisoner within the walls, she was the walls. She was the cold stone, the deep silence, the eternal, waiting heart of her domain. They buried her body in the unconsecrated ground outside the castle church, a final, futile attempt to sever her from the land she had so thoroughly corrupted. The castle was abandoned, left to the wind and the rain, a place too steeped in horror for anyone to inhabit again. But the local people knew. They knew that something had remained behind. They say her ghost still walks the crumbling halls, not as the withered crone found in that dark room, but as a pale, beautiful figure in the prime of her life, her eyes burning with a cold, feverish light. She is forever the mistress of her stone domain, eternally young and eternally powerful, forever imprisoned not in a room, but in the vast, cold tomb she had built, and then become.